Hello and welcome to Bread of Life, a daily devotional program which each week features a different area pastor. Our speaker for this week is Pastor Kerry Schmidt of Newington.
Yesterday, we talked about resolving our response. We read Isaiah 43, verses 1 through 3. I'll read verse 1 to you. But now thus saith the Lord that created thee, O Jacob, and he that formed thee, O Israel, fear not, for I have redeemed thee. I have called thee by thy name. Thou art mine. When thou passest through the waters, I will be with thee. I shared this week with our listeners that in 2010 I was diagnosed with cancer. That led me through a relatively long battle of fighting that cancer through treatment and recovery. I shared yesterday the time I sat down with my children and my wife to tell them how we would respond to this trial, this off-script moment, this time that God had alarmingly intervened in our lives with hardship, with calamity that we would have never chosen. We made a decision. We decided that night to love God, trust God, live for God, no matter what, for the rest of our lives. You know, there are some natural responses when you come into calamity. There are some human responses. Job said, "My soul is weary of life. I will leave my complaint upon myself. I will speak in the bitterness of my soul." The psalmist said in Psalm 6:3, "My soul is sore vexed." The human responses are to be traumatized with fear and anxiety and dismay and desperation, or on top of traumatization, to be ostracized, to try to salve the pain with isolation and withdrawal and even rejection of God and other important relationships in my life. Or maybe we try to demonize, we try to fix blame, with anger and resentment and maybe trouble in our spirit with God, we want to point the finger at a cause and fix blame. And these are natural responses, they're human responses. You will have these responses, but you don't want to stay there. They're not helpful. There are some spiritual responses that also are no more helpful. They seem more spiritual because they're Christianese, but they don't really help. Our first spiritual response might be to confuse our theological premises, to forget that glory theology of heaven and the cross theology of earth, that we flip them around and we expect our life on earth to be glory, and we forget that Jesus said if we're going to follow him, that we should take up our cross. We forget that the sufferings of this present time, cross theology, are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed in us. So we can spiritualize it and flip that around and think that somehow we're off track. We can moralize. In other words, we can try to determine a behavioral cause. What did I do that God is allowing this in my life? And that's definitely not helpful. Or we can minimize. We can almost dismiss the reality of suffering or pain in our own lives or others, almost treat it trivially or flippantly and not really wrestle with the hardship of the pain. You know, all of these responses, traumatize, ostracize, demonize, spiritualize, minimize, moralize, they all fail. You know why? Because they all seek to wrestle rather than rest. They seek to triumph rather than trust. They seek to fix the circumstances rather than faith, the God, the creator of the universe who lives within. We'll talk more about it tomorrow, but for today, friend, why don't you evaluate your responses? Why don't you determine that you're not going to fall prey to these natural or these pseudo-spiritual responses? Rather, rest. Rather than wrestle, choose to rest in the fact that the God of creation, the God who redeemed you, who calls you by name, says, "I will be with you."
You've been listening to Pastor Kerry Schmidt of Newington, and this has been Bread of Life, a program to encourage you from God's Word.